E niente, di solito i video li conduco io quando è possibile, però visto che io sono un cane con l'inglese, è intervenuta la sorella della mia compagna, che sarà prima o poi mia cognata, che è la Ele. Ciao Ele!
Ciao,
Ciao, chi sei? Cosa fai?
ciao, io sono Eleonora
Mm,
e sono in questo momento a Ibiza, che è dove sono cresciuta, quindi sono qua in vacanza e sono venuta a trovare mia mamma, ma in realtà vivo a Barcellona e lunedì sarò di nuovo a Barcellona perché torno a lavorare purtroppo, quindi tornerò a Barcellona.
Com'è vivere a Barcellona?
È bello, dai, è una bellissima città, molto giovane, internazionale, ci sono un sacco di cose da fare, ce n'è per tutti i gusti. È un po' stressante in estate perché ci sono tantissimi turisti, quindi diventa un po' stressante, però dai, è molto, molto bello, ci sono un sacco di opportunità, quindi bella, una bella città.
Bene, 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 bene. E quindi basta, siamo in attesa del direttore, diciamo, della fondazione Eames, sempre che non ci dia buca, ti prego non darci buca anche stavolta. Che cazzo. Ah.
No, non ci darà buca, dai.
So, okay, so as I was saying, Stefano here is a designer and a professor at a couple of universities in Italy, and he's created this YouTube channel, which is where the interview will go. And which was created for his students, but not only, with the purpose of sharing the history of the designs and the important moments in history for the design in general, so that there could be a guide and some videos for his students. So that's why we're here. And you also did one on Charles and Ray. So and we're here with you now. He wanted to ask you a few questions, as he's so fascinated by the story and the design itself, and the whole path that Charles and Ray went through. So that's why we're here. So thank you again for your time. As you know, we sent you a few questions through, but of course we can talk about. We don't have to follow the 10 questions in order. So maybe we can start off by you telling us a little bit about where and how that Charles and Ray met, and how the story began in the first place.
Okay, so Charles and Ray Eames were my grandparents, just to orient people a little bit. And when I grew up, they were just amazing people. We didn't know they were famous. In fact, if you told anybody you could be famous as a designer back then, nobody would have believed you. There would be such a thing as a starchitect or a rock star designer. And I don't know if that's good or bad, but it was just a different time. So we didn't really have the experience of having famous grandparents. We just had these people that were very, very wonderful, but also very present with us, as even though we were young. And so when Ray died, Charles had died 10 years earlier. Our mother inherited everything, and I realized, and in fact all my siblings did, that she could use some help. And so we decided to really commit to this idea of getting Charles and Ray's ideas and values out there. So, and I became the director of the Eames office, and I've been doing it for a long time. I also do my own work. And so the story of Charles and Ray as a team, two threads to it. One, Charles was born in St. Louis, and Ray was born in Sacramento, and both are cities of the heartland. Sacramento is the capital of California, but it's not, in a way. It's not as well known, say, as San Francisco or Los Angeles, but it's an important city. And so they've always had, I think, and then Charles was born in St. Louis, which at the time was kind of a competitor of Chicago. Now St. Louis is not as important economically, you might say. So what I'm trying to say is that they both came from this very, heartland of America place, each in their own way. And where they met was at Cranbrook. and they Cranbrook Academy of Arts in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, which is just outside Detroit. It was run by a man named Elio Saarinen, who was the father of Eero Saarinen. And Cranbrook was very important to both of them, partly because they met there. It's also, for Charles, he had started a career as an architect right in the middle of the Great Depression, or right at the beginning of the Great Depression. And so he was married to Catherine Mormon and I think they were actually in Europe on their honeymoon when the stock market crashed. And so he started a practice of architecture, but it was very, very difficult. And one of the things that, similar to some of the programs that are around the world now because of COVID, there were things that to allow people to work. And one of them was focused on creative people, including architects. So some architects like him made some money measuring historic buildings and things like that. Ray was born she was 5 years younger than Charles. She was born in Sacramento, like I said, and she always had a passion for art. She went to New York and was in a 2-year college there. And one of her good friends was somebody who helped fund the expats from Europe who were fleeing Nazism before World War II. And one of them was a man named Hans Hofmann, who's an important painter. He ended up teaching many of the people who made up the abstract expressionist movement. So she was actually one of his first classes at the Art Students League, and her notes are some of the only records from that first year of classes. And she was a painter, but she was also, after a decade of it, was getting frustrated with the limitations of painting. And Charles, for his part, had built some buildings in St. Louis and in Arkansas, some beautiful churches in particular. But I think he was also sort of itching at the limitations. And one of the things that he did during the Depression is he spent about 8 months in Mexico. And there's nothing to do. All the work was gone. He couldn't even get that job measuring cathedrals or whatever. And so he spent about 8 months there. And in that time, he was just on the road, and he had to support himself. He actually supported himself as a painter a lot, did odd jobs. And he was struck by something, which is that, he had just left a place where there was the stock market crash. And so people were poor and felt poor in America, and they were poor. But he's also with people who were poor in the rural areas of Mexico. And he learned something, which he realized that these people he was with had rich emotional lives, rich cultural lives, rich spiritual lives. They just didn't have any money. And he realized at that point that he had to stop using making a living as his excuse for doing things he didn't believe in. Because if you don't do the things you believe in, you can't bring your whole self to bear on the topic or the action or whatever. And so so it changed his life and his attitude. And it took him a couple of years. He did some more buildings. But in 1937, he went to Cranbrook. He started as a student, then was a professor the next year and the head of the industrial design department his last year. At that point, he also met Eero Saarinen, who was his best friend, personally and professionally. And then his marriage to his first wife was falling apart, and they eventually got divorced in 1941. And around that time, Ray came to Cranbrook, and as she said, it was sort of humorous that she was only there a couple of months. She really audited, but it was obviously an important couple of months because that's where they met. And she went back to New York, and the other thing is that her mother had died, I think in 1939. And so after wrapping up the affair, she decided to, but she was frustrated with the limitations of painting because she felt like no matter what she did, people would sort of try to pigeonhole it as a style when she was actually trying to approach things more philosophically, you might say. So so her friend Ben Baldwin, who is a fellow student of hers with Hans Hofmann, had been Charles's studio mate and said, "Oh, you really should come to Cranbrook." So she came, and she was auditing one of Charles's classes, and they met. And as the expression goes, the rest is history. This time, literally. Yeah. And so then they got married. They drove to California for a fresh start. And that's what happened. I mean, I
It's
can keep going, but it sort of answers your question. Yeah.
sorry.
I said I can keep going, but that basically answers your question.
Yeah, that's a great story. And as you say, it was fate or it was destiny that they had to meet, even though it was short. But there you go. There you have it.
Glad it happened.
Yeah. So once they they met and they started working together, one of the things that they worked on, or the most important thing they worked on, was the plywood. So how did they get to this idea, and how did they get to experiment on the plywood in itself? So how did they get there?
So what happened was that the Museum of Modern Art had a competition called the Organic Furniture Competition, and it was in 1940. I think the submissions were were in 1940, and then the awards were announced in early 1941. And it was one of those things that it was a competition that every young architect and designer submitted to, I imagine. I don't know if that's literally true, but it was very many people that one knows are in the in the submissions list and things like that. And the reason was very simple. First prize was that your furniture would be built by a manufacturer that Museum of Modern Art had arranged for, and then it would be sold at Bloomingdale's and displayed at the Museum of Modern Art. So it was just, I mean, even today, if you did such a competition, I guarantee you all of your students, and maybe even you, would be submitting, Stefano, if the prize was guaranteed, that Molteni would make it, or Vitra would make it, or Herman Miller would make it. It was that, it was that caliber. And so what happened was that Charles Eames and Eero Saarinen made a submission, and they were really interested in this idea of a single piece plywood chair. They had made a chair called the Kleinhans chair for a concert hall that Elio Saarinen had designed in upstate New York. And so in that concert hall, they designed the furniture. So Elio designed the structure, but they did the Eames and Charles and Eero made the furniture. And if you look at that chair, it's a cool chair, but it's very Alto-esque. It's a two-dimensional curve of the plywood. And so what they were trying to do with the organic chair is to make a three-dimensional curve. And they thought at the time that they could use a technique which was a little bit like paper mache, but you would basically, tear strips of plywood, and then you would layer them, and that's how you would get. You would layer them, and that's how you would give strength to it. And so that's what they did, and that was the idea. But what's interesting, and this is, I think, very relevant for students today, is they didn't actually have to make a chair. They made a picture. They photographed a chair. They photographed models, and they even made a plaster model. And so what they did it, and they won. It was super cool. They had 3 designs. They had some case goods that were also part of it, and they won. But then so first prize was it being made, and they had some real problems, because it turns out if you use that strip technique, that sort of layering, it works great for a tray, but it doesn't support a person. And so what they had to figure out another way to make it. And so. And there's a note that Charles wrote, I think to Eero or maybe to Elliot Noyes, but where he said, if I'd known how it was going to turn out, I would have designed it totally differently. And it was at that point, I think it was a critical moment for him, because it was realizing that if you want the design to flow from the manufacturing process, from all the constraints of making the object, then you had better figure out how to make it yourself. And the reason why I think it's so relevant to students today is that basically what they did is no different than a student or a professional who makes something on AutoCAD or 3D rendering without actually engaging with the materiality. And I've certainly talked to students and say, well, what's it going to be made of? They said, well, I was thinking aluminum, but I just changed the program, and so now it's made out of wood. But they actually haven't done the learning. And I'm not picking on people. I'm just trying to say that this was integral to Charles and Ray's design philosophy, is this tension between being a visionary, but also actually making, figuring out how to make the object itself. Yeah. And so there's, if you look at those early organic chairs, what you can see is that there's some that so basically, for one thing, it was supposed to be a wooden chair, and the splintering was so much they had to upholster it. And so then they and so they did that, and this is where Charles really realized that the design that design didn't just include the look of something. Design was also its physicality. And around this time, so as they were struggling with this, Charles and Ray realized that well, they were going to get married. There's a great line where Charles says in a letter to her when she's in New York, we must see each other soon. This business of being dream people in each other's minds is no good. It's super romantic, and it's also a great it's a great design lesson as far as they were concerned, because they didn't want to design a dream chair. They wanted to design a chair you could actually sit in. So they didn't want to just sketch it and say, wouldn't this be great? They really, part of making it great was actually doing it. So so by this time they got married, they moved to California, and one of their intentions to move to California was have a new start. Charles had just been divorced. They also they liked the possibility of working in and near Hollywood, because they already had a strong interest in film. Charles even made a couple of films at Cranbrook, and also the aerospace industry is out there. And there was just generally the classic sort of California dream thing of just different kinds of opportunity. And so they came to California and they started experimenting in their apartment with this molded plywood. And so they really need to figure out how to do it. They invented something called the Kazam machine to press the things in, and then by that time, so I don't need to tell to Europeans that the World War II had already started, but for America it didn't really start till 1941 in December. So when Pearl Harbor happened, that was a really transformative moment, even though the war had started in September 39 or even earlier, depending how you look at it. So but the point is that a lot of things happened because it was different now for America. And one of the things that they learned from a doctor friend of theirs, a guy named Dr. Wendell Scott from St. Louis, is that when a wounded soldier had a metal splint on his leg, which was the norm, the walking, of the medics or whoever, the orderlies, would create vibrations and so the metal would amplify those vibrations, and the soldier would be in a way worse off. Would tear the wound open more than if they probably just grabbed a wooden stick to do it, just because of that aspect. So they said, well, hey, we're working on wood. So the important thing about this for the record, is that before the splints happened, Charles and Arrow had made the organic chair. Charles and Ray had made experimental shell prototypes, which were not at all ready to go, of shell chairs. And they had made they had begun work on the molded plywood sculpture. So when people sometimes say, well, the chairs came from the splints, it's not true. What is true is that they got an incredibly valuable amount of mass production experience. And it was the first really mass-produced object that they made. The organic chair was technically mass-produced, but in terms of being a complete Eamesian vision, it was a little bit too bespoke for what they were trying to do. But I mean, they were made in quantity, so it counts in that way. But in terms of Charles Ray really understanding the physicality, it was the splint that was the first item like that. And they did a pilot program about a few thousand. They did 150,000 under a big contract for the Navy. And at that point, that was way beyond their financial resources. That's why they partnered with a company called Evans Products, which probably, if you followed if you're a collector, you know that name very well.
Okay. And how did when you started talking about the splints and the Navy, and of course the productions that they went on to do, how did they actually get to know the doctor who then brought them into this?
The doctor was a friend from St. Louis, where Charles was born, where he practiced architecture before. I think he was basically a friend, and it would have made sense that conversations would happen like that casually because I mean, LA was a military center, but also San Diego was a big naval area, and so it was actually really originally for the Navy that this one's written.
Okay, great. And moving on to it's something different subject. So with regards to the visit to the Ulm School, thanks to Max Bill. Can you tell us how this happened, why Charles and Ray actually visited, and how this all went about?
And do you know what year that was?
No, I don't personally, but Stefano I'm sure knows.
Scuola di Ulm School.
Sì, che anno?
Erano gli anni, tra gli anni 50 e gli anni 60. Cioè,
He says between the 50s and the 60s.
Okay.
In Germania, in Germany.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know a huge amount about that, and I apologize. You had to ask that in the original group of questions, so I will try to do it. But what I will say is that they were they were very omnivorous people. I just want to check one thing. That they, like I think it's 1955. So 1955, they they went to Germany as part of a cultural program with Robert Motherwell, an American painter, and John Cage, the musician or the composer. He was there, and they shortly thereafter they started their relationship with Vitra. From 53 to 57 was when the negotiations were happening, and they spent some time there. So they were they traveled a lot, particularly for that era. And between, Ray's experiences with the German expressionists, and then people like Billy Wilder, who's obviously more from Austria, I think that it was natural for them to be meeting people and introduced to people. They actually made a film called Two Baroque Churches in Germany, which is a beautiful little film. And so it's there was I think they had a signed, I know they had a signed book from Max Bill, which comes from around that era. So I guess what I'm saying is that it's not surprising to me in any way that they would have gone there. And they had I think they had an interest in education in general. And so I think it's okay. So I was actually the reason I was looking up the date is I think that they went to that school in 1958, and they showed some movies. But I think that's different than the 1955 tour with Robert Motherwell. And so if they were showing movies in 58, I would suspect that they showed Day of the Dead. Sorry, no, not Day of the Dead. Well, they could have, but I meant to say Toccata for Toy Trains, Parade, Communications Primer would have been the sort of things that they do. And if you're more interested in the topic, in general, a great resource for this sort of thing is the finding aids at the Library of Congress. And there's a finding aid for the manuscript division, which tends to have these kinds of the documentation that would go with this. But this is 58 is a provocative year because that's the year they went to India, so maybe they did it on the way there. So now I'm kind of speculating, but the bigger point I was trying to make is that there's no they managed to touch a lot of bases. I mean, there's a great letter that Ray wrote to Charles when in 56 or 55 when they were working on the lounge chair, and so she sends a sketch of how the lounge chair looks at that point, and then she says, she also tells him where to get the shoes that she wants, but also there's a mention that somebody just told us about this really interesting guy, Jean Prouvé, that maybe you should try to meet. So there was one of the things that I'm struck by as I look at this era is that without the internet, which we sort of think of as sort of the complete expression of connectivity, people, these sorts of folks, whether through the magazines, through correspondence, were able to know who the other folks of interest might be. And another example, which is not so closely related, which is, it's related, but not in terms of the countries, is that right after Ray died, I was at the Eames house, and a man came to visit, and he was Jorn Utsen's son, and he talked about how his father, on his way to Sydney, the only time Jorn Utsen went to Sydney was before the competition, as you probably know from all the stories around that project. So he crashed at the Eames house for a couple of days. It just blows my mind that in that time, that he would know that this is one of the things he had to do. I mean, it's not it was on the radar of certain folks, and but this guy, and Terence Conran talked to me about how getting Arts and Architecture magazine in London, during the 50s, because Britain still had wage and price controls until the late 50s. So that this idea that there was ways for people to, maybe it took a couple of months, but there was really this connectivity. And actually, on a sad note, the amazing Italian architect and designer Gregotti, who died of COVID very early on in this whole tragedy. He was a friend of theirs, and there's a beautiful letter that Charles wrote to him, and about giving him a copy of the film Powers of Ten, and talking about the first version. And one of the things he says that Charles said in that letter was that while they were making the movie, and as they got to the extreme powers of 10, so into the atom and to the edge of space, he said the same things that we need to visualize the movie are the same things that the governments of the world guard as their secrets. And then he said the governments of the world are going to have to choose between their secrets, or eventually going to have to choose between their secrets and the planet Earth. And just this great, it's so true. And it's, but that's the kind of level of, so the fact that they would go with Max Bill is, they may have been invited. They may have said, we're going to be in the area. Because again, in these circles of people really trying to create ideas and thinking around design, there was an awareness of each other's work, I think.
Thank you. And since you mentioned the Eames home, how did they design, or how did they get to the idea of designing the home as it is, as so original maybe for that time?
So the story of the Eames house is a beautiful story. It's part of the it connected heavily to the case study house program, which was a kind of I guess you call it kind of an experimental architecture program. It was what was important about it is that John Tenzo, the founder of the magazine, commissioned, I think, 35 designs, and then 25 were built, or 24 or something. I'm not always quite clear on all the different numbers, but the real point was that they wanted to create kind of three-dimensional source material for both potential homeowners and for other architects. In other words, you can make all the plans you want, but when you actually build the house, then that's a different kind of thing. And the other interesting thing about the program is that I'm not convinced that the intention of the program was really for everybody to copy each of the houses, even though that sure happened. But what it was really doing was inviting the people of LA especially, but in general, homeowners, to collage what they liked from each house. because you could see, in other words, you could really, like the Eames house is a beautiful spiral staircase, but you might say, you know, I'm not going, you know, the kids are going to be upstairs. I'm not going up and down all the time. And so, but what I really like is this, you know, this really high vaulted ceiling in the living room. And then, but somebody else might say, this, boy, that staircase, yeah, it's a little trick, you know, now, yes, it's unusual, but I just love it. But I really want more square footage. So having a, you know, a 17, I guess 6-meter high ceiling doesn't make sense, because I'd rather have more of a footprint for bedrooms or whatever. And so the idea though was that if you see these buildings, then that inspires you to take it to the next step. And so the original, they were Charles and Arrow, again, the team in this case, designed 2 buildings for the case study program. The first was for for Charles and Ray, and that was going to be a very cantilevered structure that went from the hillside, roughly from where the kitchen is now, if you know the area, if you've been there, and out into the middle of the meadow. And then the other one was for Intensa himself. The Intensa house was built as planned, as Charles and Arrow designed it. But the second house, the Eames house, case study house number 8, was redesigned on the spot. So what happened was that, and our mother remembered having picnics with Charles and Ray out in the meadow, and just how there was this whole experience of falling in love with the meadow and realizing that they were on the verge of doing what architects always do, which is to find someplace great and ruin it with the building. So they redesigned it to be built from the same pile of parts, because another part of the whole idea was off-the-shelf parts, and they only had to order 1 extra beam or something like that to make the house that you see today. And so when you come to the Eames house, it's a very what's interesting is that it's very rectilinear. It's a pair of steel boxes, but it's tucked into the hillside behind a row of trees that were already there. And in a funny way, it feels more integrated to the environment than a lot of buildings that try to be organic. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but to create organic forms. But just by being honestly itself, and the respect that's shown to the meadow, which is beautiful. And yet it's not what you would normally do with the property. I mean, most people would put the house right in the middle of that. And that respect just shines out. There appear to be 2 structures, and there are in the sense, but it's all called the Eames house because there's among other reasons, there's a retaining wall that joins the 2. So it's actually one structure.
Nice. Thank you. No, we actually haven't been there, but it would be amazing at some point to have the opportunity to let's see when all of this is over and we can start, you know, living our lives normally again. Then it would be great. So with regards to their work, of course, it's really interesting also to know that the close relationship, the relationship they had with George Nelson for Herman Miller. So how did that develop? So how did it all come about?
So after World War II, so there was a guy named Gilbert Rohde who was a important designer, and he, I think, died in a car accident. He died pretty young, but he was the head designer for Herman Miller. So Herman Miller was, can't remember how all the math works, but originally it was a company that did in the 20s did colonial reproduction furniture, and the man who owned the company was a guy named DJ Dupree, very amazing character, very religious man, pillar of his community. They preached, is Dutch Reformed Church in Michigan, in Holland, Michigan. So even a bit out of town from, say, Grand Rapids, which itself is a couple hours from Detroit. And so Gilbert Rohde came. So DJ Dupree was a very honest guy, and he was really, he had a lot of great credos about how to run a business. And one day, Gilbert Rohde had designed a new collection of modern furniture, from the 30s, so definitely in a certain style. But And he said, and Gilroy came into DJ Dupree's showroom and said, this furniture isn't honest. And DJ Dupree had never been called dishonest in his entire life. I mean, he was actually probably a bit offended. But Gilroy said, you're making furniture that's from another time. You're not even exactly making it the way it was made then, because it is a different time. You need to get with the program. And so they had a lot of conversations, and in the end, DJ came to the conclusion that this man was right. It was also during the Depression, so it was, it's not like the other way was working especially well. And so really it was a great partnership. And some of those designs they definitely feel from a little bit earlier era than say, the stuff from the 50s and 60s, but it's really beautiful furniture. And then, like I said, he died suddenly in the 40s. And so DJ Dupree saw an article that George Nelson had written about storage, I think. And he just thought he liked this guy's thinking, he liked his approach, and he hired George Nelson to become the design director, as well as to be able to design things for it. So George Nelson saw a show that was done at the Barclay Hotel in 1945 December, so after the war, but more people were still figuring everything out. And it was basically the last show that Charles and Ray were going to do through Evans Products, because that was the company that had the financial backing, but they really didn't want to be in the furniture industry. So there's some cards like from Charles's mother to his sister saying, I don't know what they're going to do after this. It's sort of a last gasp or something like that. And so, but they also, Evans had done well by Charles and Ray, and so they didn't want to leave them hanging, but that was sort of as far as they could go. And but the furniture was incredible. It's included the molded plywood, they're familiar with the other case goods or even some other designs that are in production. And so what happened was that Nelson saw that and said to DJ Dupree and his sons Max and Hugh, who both go on to lead the company later, you need to see this. And these people Charles and Ray Eames are 5 years ahead of everybody. And in an oral history, Nelson admitted that he actually wondered if it was a good career move for him to introduce Charles and Ray when he had been at Herman Miller for about a couple of months. But in the end, he decided that it was the ethical thing to do. And so then Museum of Modern Art saw the show also, and that's where the April 1946 show, Furniture by Charles Eames, happened. That's what happened. So the Duprees came, and so the Duprees started to license the furniture, and license the rights to distribute it, and then within about a year or so, they became the manufacturers. So that relationship, 46, and that was all triggered by George. And he, and I think that, for me, the part of the lesson is that Charles and Ray had done all that exploration and research on their own, and they always retained the rights. So because sometimes young designers will say to me, well, that's no, sometimes they'll say that, well, they want to get Charles and Ray's job at Herman Miller or at Vitra, and there is no Charles and Ray's job at Herman Miller Vitra. There is the job of, what you have to do is create your position there. But also it's not, the way that they got to Herman Miller and then to Vitra was that they took a lot of risks on themselves. I mean, and it wasn't always a sure thing. When our mother was applying to colleges, the furniture was not doing that great yet, and so she asked her dad what to put on the form for your father's profession, and he said just put down clown, because he and Ray were working on a clown act, and that was going to be their backup for the work out. But the point was that it goes back to that lesson from Mexico, that you have to be able to bring your whole self to bear. And so as a result of taking that chance on themselves, when they were working with Evans and then with Herman Miller, they were in a position to, what I would say is that if any designer went to a major manufacturer today with a new design a new way to make that design and the tooling, I guarantee you they'll take your call.
Yeah.
But to have just a sketch of something that will be, even something that will be very beautiful, is that's only part of the design process. And so George Nelson recognized that, and so they, and you know, they did a lot of things together. They did the Moscow show. There's a lot of mutual respect, and that's how that happened.
Yeah, well, I would say it worked out really well. Yeah.
It did.
Yeah, definitely. And just one other product, sorry to ask you so many questions and to take up so much of your time. Just one other thing, one other design that, you know, that Stefano is really interested in is the elephant chair. So he wanted to know how did they think about this, and why did they think about the elephant chair, and how did this happen?
Okay, hold on one sec.
Tu lo vedi, Ele, vero?
Sì, tu no?
Non lo vedo, non lo vedo.
No, veramente.
Ti giuro, non lo vedo, non lo vedo.
Ma sì, lo vedo benissimo. Ma mi sa che andasse detto a prendere la sedia, sai?
Grande.
Sorry. So the elephant is a great thing. I should have had an elephant handy, but I don't have one. So so the elephant was, so the first thing is it was a toy. So and they the first one they gave to our mother, and so it was part of the family collection. And but I think that so the very first piece of furniture the Eameses manufactured en masse is the children's chair. And then, I mean, they made others at the same time, but if you look at that chair, the curves are very, they're a little bit simpler than they are in the LCW and things like that. What I think is interesting about the elephant, and which is why it never got produced en masse at the time, is that it's actually each part of the elephant, because it's two parts, is harder to make than the LCW, because you need a different kind of mold. So I think that what they were experimenting, they were trying ideas, and then, but I think that the reason that the elephant is important is that you've seen the molded plywood sculpture that they made, and it's very beautiful. But the truth is, with abstract sculptures, you don't. It has to work for you visually, so you can like it or not like it. But in the end, there's not like a rule book for whether it looks like. But the good thing about an elephant is even a child can tell you if you made a good elephant.
That's true.
Well, the same way it's like with language. Like if you go to China and you say shishi to say thank you, and the grown-ups are polite and the kids are laughing because the kids know you sound like, ridiculous. It's like I sound literally, and I speak Spanish, and people beg me not to speak Spanish. They ask me to speak in English when I try to give a talk there. So the point is that the point is that 5-year-old knows intuitively more about their own language than somebody who's studied it for 15 years. And so the elephant has that same quality, is that, you can say it's an abstract sculpture and who's going to argue with you? But with an elephant, it's a great test of the skill of how you can control, how you can control the plywood. And so it passes the test. And so, but the reason why it never really came out until we did it in 2007 was because it was pretty complicated. And then we did it for Charles's anniversary, 100th, or his centennial, I should say. And then we agreed at that time that if it was successful, then we'd bring it back in plastic, so it would be more affordable, because it is so complicated to make. But it's a beautiful object, and I think it also speaks to what I was talking about. That letter about being dream people in each other's minds. You can sketch a dream elephant, but to actually make the tactile thing happen, when you're looking at the prototype, you're the ones who figured out how to use the material. So it's on you. You don't just send it to the manufacturer and say, make it a little bit better. You have to figure it out. And I think that and when you look at Charles and Ray's work together, one of the common threads is that just about every medium that I'm aware of that they worked on, there was always a period when it was just the two of them. And as Ray said, when you're figuring things out, you don't want to waste everybody else in the office's time. I mean, one thing, the office was really small at the beginning, but that plywood they experimented with in their apartment, just them, their early films, just them. Then when you make Powers of 10, you can't do that without a whole team. You can't figure out all the issues there. I mean, I suppose you could, but it definitely helped having a whole team to work on the aluminum group. But the very beginning of that, the sketch of that idea of the aluminum group is really, it's something that happens in that intimate way, and then you expand out. And so, in fact, the sketch of the aluminum group, what I find so great about the aluminum group is that when you see it, you assume the first thing they drew was the beautiful silhouette, the elegant silhouette of the aluminum group, right? But in fact, the first sketch is of a detail of the way the fabric will fit into the groove on the side of the side member, and then wrap around. So the as Charles said, and it always sounds like it's one of those things that people say, but it's really true. You say the last thing we think about when we're designing a chair is how it will look, even though they're well known for the beauty of their chairs. And again, that's part of probably why the chairs are so beautiful, because they're relentlessly focused on getting to the essence of it.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you one last question, and we're going to leave you alone. So you're taking forever. So something, can you tell us more on a personal note? What is one of the best thing or one of the best memories you have of your grandparents, or one of the things that they left you that the things that you care the most?
I mean, there are lots of great memories. One story that one story that I like has to do with as a kid, I was always into science and animals and zoology and all that, and so I was sort of I was also into filmmaking, and so when I was about 12 or 13, so I was a volunteer at the Municipal Aquarium in San Francisco. Okay. And one day they invited me. It's a whole complicated thing, but basically this whale shark, those are the sharks that they don't eat people. And so one of them had gotten trapped in a lagoon in the South Pacific, in what's now Kiribati in Canton Island. And so the local TV station wanted to send a couple of kids to go swim with the whale shark and make a little movie of it. Kind of crazy, but okay. I got chosen, and this other kid was kind of a child actor, and he got chosen, and we flew there for a week. And it was really, we had to fly in a military transport. It was like, it was a little, I can't believe my parents let me go, but that's interesting. So, but the night before I was going to leave, we lived in San Francisco, and Charles and Ray were in Los Angeles. Charles showed up at the door of our house, and I think it probably told my mom, but we didn't know he was coming. And he came, he said, Ray and I have been thinking about your trip, and we're really worried about it. And not about the shark. What they were worried is that I was going to borrow my parents' Nikon to take pictures, and I'd be so afraid of dropping it in the ocean that I wouldn't even take it on the boat, and I'd never get some good pictures, and it'd be just a missed opportunity. And it's true, I was really freaking out because my parents were going to let me use their Nikon, and it was a big deal. It was their camera, and if I did drop it in the ocean, it would not go well. Yeah. So what Charles says, that we found this, and this is hard to believe for the current generation, but before iPhones, there was a moment in time where they made not disposable cameras, but much cheaper 35mm cameras, and they were and so he got me this very cheap camera. He emphasized that it was cheap. He said it's 35mm. I think it was a little bit point and shoot, but it was legitimate lens and all that stuff, and so he so he said, if you drop us in the ocean, it doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. It's really cheap. And what's great about it is that they could have afforded at that time to buy me a Hasselblad, right? Or my own. But they knew that's not what I needed. What I needed was something that would let it be unprecious for me to be using this camera. And so it was appropriate. And appropriateness is a really important word for design, because a lot of what one's trying to do is to figure out what the appropriate solution is. And I just love that. I don't even think my parents realized how freaked out I was to borrow the Nikon. But it was and I think that, and then I did a book once where I put this with a story that my mom told about when she was a little girl. She was out painting with Charles, and she was and this was during the Depression, and they were using sable hair brushes. And so the other parents would say, "What are you doing? You're spoiling. How can you waste the money on sable hair brushes for your child? I mean, she's just a kid. She doesn't care." And he said, "I'm not doing it for her. I'm doing it for me, because they're so expensive that I'm going to be sure that she washes them up each time and learns to take care of her tools. Where if I don't worry about it, it's going to send the wrong message." So in both cases, it's about appropriateness. It's the most expensive thing is not always the right answer. And the cheapest thing is, it's about what is right, and that's when you get back to it. Design addresses itself to the need, and that word. And Ray said, talking about Charles after his death, that word appropriateness is really critical. They also had this idea of way it should be-ness, and that if an object was really well designed, the idea of it having been designed wouldn't even come up.
And did you drop it in the end or not?
No, actually, my first pictures that were published came from that, and I published them in the local the Academy of Sciences Science Journal. And now people go visit whale sharks more easily, but at the time it was because somehow a cyclone had blown the shark into the lagoon, so it couldn't get out. So that's why it was exciting, because you actually knew there would be a shark there.
Yeah,
it wasn't like running around like looking for it. It was stuck.
Yeah. Nice. Thank you so much. I think unless Stefano wants to ask anything else. Stefano, vuoi dire qualcos'altro, vuoi aggiungere altro?
Volevo ringraziarlo per tutto e nulla. È stata veramente una cosa importante, perché comunque questa testimonianza aiuterà tante persone anche a studiare i suoi nonni.
So yeah, he's thanking you very much, and thank you so much for your testimony, which will help a lot of students get to know your grandparents a little better, and have some of your testimony on designs and the things you said. So thank you so much for your time and your availability.
And you'll probably get a kick out of this door you see here. This colored door was from Paul Rand's office.
Really?
Who was the designer, the graphic designer for IBM. So I had a chance to get it. So I like being surrounded by those colors. But and I talked to him about the Eameses also. One of the I'll just say this, is that I think what you're doing is important, and I'm glad. Hopefully you're doing with other people, because after my grandmother died, I did 200 hours of oral histories with people who knew them. And this documentation is super important, because I wanted to understand them not just as a grandchild. And I was in LA for about 3 years before Ray died. So we got to know each other as adults, which was quite great. But it was also interviewing other people, because these stories, whether mine are the best ones or not, or a value, doesn't matter. In a sense, if you're doing this in a systematic way, you start to capture the things that matter. It's important for each generation to do that. So it really helped me understand, and part of the reason I ended up, making sure that I put a lot of my personal time and energy into the Eames work. So,
thank you. Absolutely, thank you.
Cool. All right. Good luck. Hope your students do well, and stay safe.
You too. Take care.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Let me know when it goes up.
Yeah, sure. We will.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. See ya.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Ciao.
Ciao. Ciao.